There are stories in American history that sound more like myths than fact. Tales of revenge, blood, pride, and loss that seem too dramatic to be real. But the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys was no legend. It was a brutal reality that turned mountains red, left children fatherless, and carved an unforgettable scar across the Appalachian landscape. It wasn't just a family fight, it was a war that haunted generations. What makes two families hate each other so deeply, so violently, that they choose decades of bloodshed over peace? To understand this infamous feud, we must travel back to the rugged border between Kentucky and West Virginia, where isolation bred suspicion and honor meant everything. In this region, family loyalty wasn't just a value, it was the law. And breaking that law could cost you your life. The roots of the Hatfield-McCoy conflict go deeper than most people realize. It wasn't just about land or stolen pigs, though. Those played a part. No, this was about something far more volatile: identity, loyalty, and vengeance. The seeds were sown in the soil of the Civil War, where old alliances split families and neighbors became enemies. Randolph McCoy, known as Randall, was a proud man from Pike County, Kentucky. He had fathered 16 children and carried the weight of his family name like armor. Across the Tug Fork River, in West Virginia, lived William Anderson Hatfield, Devil Anse, a charismatic, sharp-eyed patriarch. Devil Anse had built a timber empire and commanded fierce loyalty from his kin and neighbors. These were not just men. They were symbols, two alpha males standing as pillars of power in their communities, both unwilling to bend. That pride would soon turn to poison. The first real spark of violence can be traced to the end of the Civil War. Although Devil Anse had initially fought for the Confederacy, he abandoned the cause in its later years. The McCoys, however, remained loyal to the South until the bitter end. This divergence bred a subtle but growing tension. War doesn't end when the guns fall silent, it lingers in the minds of those who fought. And in their grudges, that in 1865, Randolph McCoy's brother, Asa Harmon McCoy, returned from the Union Army only to be hunted down and murdered by a group of Confederate guerrillas known as the Logan Wildcats, a band associated with the Hat. Although Devil Anse himself denied involvement, suspicion naturally pointed his way. This was the first blood drawn, and it would not be the last. Still, for more than a decade, things remained on a low boil. Both families thrived in their own ways, but mistrust simmered beneath every interaction. And then came the pig dot. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? That a stolen pig could fuel one of the bloodiest feuds in U.S. history. But in these mountain communities, livestock wasn't just food, it was currency. In 1878, Randolph McCoy accused Floyd Hatfield, Devil Anse's cousin, of stealing one of his pigs. A trial was held, and both families took sides. The judge, a Hatfield; the star witness, a McCoy who sided with the Hatfields. That witness was Bill Stanton, a relative of both families. When he testified in favor of the Hatfields, it enraged the McCoy. Not long after, Stanton was killed by two McCoy brothers, Sam and Paris, who were later acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. But in truth, the lines were drawn even deeper that day. Betrayal within blood, justice twisted by alliances. It was no longer about pigs. It was about vengeance. Then came the forbidden romance. Like something out of Shakespeare, Rosanna McCoy fell in love with John Hatfield, Devil Anse's son. Their secret meetings and passionate affair should have been a story of unity between warring families. But instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. When Rosanna ran away to live with the Hatfields, she was shunned by her own family. But Devil Anse, seeing the risks, refused to let John marry her. Heartbroken and pregnant, Rosanna returned home in shame. Later, John married Rosanna's cousin instead. That betrayal devastated Harrod, further blackened the view of the Hatfields. What could have been a bridge became a weapon. It wasn't long before bullets replaced words. On Election Day in 1882, tensions exploded. Three of Randolph McCoy's sons, Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud, got into a heated argument with Devil Anse's brother, Ellison Hatfield. It escalated into a violent brawl. Ellison was stabbed 26 times and shot. As he lay dying, the Hatfields captured the McCoy brothers and held them until Ellison's fate was sealed. When he succumbed to his wounds, the Hatfields took justice into their own hands. They tied the three McCoy boys to pawpaw trees and executed them by firing squad. It was no longer a feud, it was a war. These acts of vengeance triggered an unstoppable chain reaction. Retaliation became a way of life. Each killing demanded another. The mountains echoed with gunshots, and children grew up learning that some names were not to be trusted, nor spared. By this point, the Hatfields were not just responding, they were organizing. Armed posses began raiding McCoy land, torching homes and hunting down family members. The McCoys, in turn, fortified themselves and waited, rifles in hand. The land became a battlefield. Not unlike the war, both families had survived, but the most horrifying act was yet to come. On New Year's Day, in 1888, Hatfield forces launched a coordinated attack on the McCoy homestead. Flames engulfed the cabin as the family scrambled to escape. Randolph managed to flee, but his son Calvin and daughter Alifair were shot and killed. His wife Sarah was beaten so severely that she never fully recovered. This was more than revenge, it was terrorism. the nation began to take notice. Newspapers picked up the story, painting it as a savage Appalachian drama. The feud had become a media sensation, a twisted soap opera of real blood and real death. Public opinion turned, and the law, long hesitant to interfere in the rugged border, no longer look away. By the end of the decade, bounty hunters, militias, and legal forces stepped in. Dozens of men were arrested. Trials began. And finally, after years of unchecked violence, a sense of justice crept in. But at what cost? By the time the dust began to settle, more than a dozen lives had been lost. Families were destroyed. Land was abandoned. The Appalachian region carried the trauma like a ghost that refused to leave. Even those who survived were haunted by the violence. And yet, was it over? What keeps a feud like this alive? How does hatred stretch across generations, burning hotter with each retelling? We'll explore that in the next chapter. But first, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect your family name? If you're finding this story as intense as we are, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because in the next episode, things get even darker. When the McCoy cabin went up in flames and the blood of Calvin and Allie Fair stained the snow, something shifted. This was no longer just a family feud. It had become a national scandal. The massacre shocked not only the Appalachian region but the entire country. People who had never heard of the Tug Fork River now knew the names Hatfield and McCoy. But with the world watching, a new question began to emerge. Was there still a chance for justice? Or was this just revenge dressed in laws? Clothing. How do you deliver justice when the entire system has already taken sides? The lines were blurred. Lawmen had brothers in both families. Judges owed favors. Sheriffs feared for their lives. And in the heart of Appalachia, the law was whatever the most powerful man said it was. That power, for years, had belonged to Devil Anse Hatfield. But now, after the New Year's massacre, the tide began to turn. Randolph McCoy, broken and enraged, turned to an unlikely elite governor, Simon Buckner of Kentucky. Buckner, alarmed by the escalating violence, issued arrest warrants for the Hatfield clan. But crossing the state line into West Virginia was a dangerous legal gray area. The Hatfields claimed jurisdiction protected them. The McCoys insisted. Otherwise, that's when Kentucky took matters into its own hands. A group of bounty hunters hired and armed by Kentucky authorities crossed into West Virginia and kidnapped 9 members of the Hatfield faction, including Devil Anse's sons. This bold and illegal move triggered a furious legal battle between the states. The Hatfields cried foul, extradition without due process. But Kentucky had blood on its mind, not paperwork. The most explosive trial of the feud was about to begin. All eyes turned to the trial of Cotton Top Mounts, a mentally disabled relative of the Hatfields who had been present during the New Year's attack. Despite questions about his sanity and his actual role in the violence, Cotton Top was convicted of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. On February 18, 1890, he stood on the gallows, trembling. Before the trapdoor dropped, he spoke for chilling words. They made me do it. Moments later, his body swung lifeless in the Appalachian wind. Was justice served, or was Cotton Top simply a sacrificial lamb? Meanwhile, Devil Anse, the man seen by many as the architect of the feud, evaded capture. He withdrew from the public eye, retreating deeper into the mountains. Stories circulated of his hideouts, his armed guards, his eerie silence. The once charismatic leader was now a shadow, his empire crumbling under the weight of blood. But even as law caught up with the Hatfields, the McCoys found no peace. Randolph McCoy, haunted by grief and guilt, moved his remaining family away from Pike County. He became a hollow man, a ghost in a preacher's coat. He died in 1914, penniless, still carrying the wounds of a war that consumed his entire lineage. So, why did it take so long to stop? Because this wasn't just about right or wrong, it was about legacy. In the Appalachian Mountains, your family name was your currency, your reputation, your shield. To allow an insult to go unanswered was to invite ruin and to show mercy. That was weakness. Each Hatfield and McCoy born into this storm was raised with the stories. Who killed whom? Who lied? Who betrayed? Vengeance became tradition. Violence became loyalty. And in such a world, forgiveness wasn't just difficult, was dangerous. Even years after the peak of the feud, tensions lingered like smoke in the hollows. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid each other. Marriages were whispered about like scandal. Children were taught who to hate before they learned how to spell. The feud had become folklore, but its pain was all too real. And the media? They couldn't get enough. Newspapers painted the Hatfields as wild mountaineers, barely civilized, living by gun and grudge. The McCoys were framed as helpless victims, though the reality was far murkier. Truth didn't matter. The public wanted drama, and the feud delivered. Journalists from New York to Chicago sent correspondents into the hills. They took photographs of toothless men with rifles, women in mourning black, burning homes, and blood-stained trees. They turned a tragedy into a circus. But this national attention created a new kind of pressure, one that would eventually bring the feud to a surprising halt. By the early 20th century, the world was changing. Railroads pushed deeper into Appalachia. Coal companies arrived with money and machinery. The mountains, once isolated and self-contained, were now being connected to the broader world. And with that came modernization. New laws, new schools, new ideas. Among those ideas was reconciliation. It began quietly. A few Hatfields and McCoys started doing business together. Others joined the same churches. And in 1976, yes, nearly a century later, something truly astonishing happened. Descendants from both families came together to sign a truce. With cameras flashing and reporters taking notes, more than 60 direct descendants of Devil Anse and Randolph McCoy gathered in Pikeville, Kentucky. They shook hands, posed for pictures, and declared an official end to the feud. It was part publicity stunt, part healing ceremony, but for many, it marked a turning point. Then, in 2003, the Hatfields and McCoys were recognized by the Guinness World Records for the longest-running feud in history. A strange kind of fame, but also a reminder. Even the deepest wounds can eventually begin to close. And yet, the question lingers like fog over the mountains. Did anyone really win? Both families lost? Fathers? Sons? Daughters? Both communities were stained with violence? Both names became infamous. What began as a few sparks of anger burned into a wildfire that consumed everything, even Devil Anse. In his final years, seemed changed. He was baptized in 1911, built a small chapel, and turned to religion. Some say it was guilt, others say it was fear. But maybe, just maybe, it was peace. Today, statues of both patriarchs stand miles apart, staring silently into the distance. Tourists take selfies, school children read their stories, but the ground still holds the memory of gunshots. The trees still whisper names, and some Appalachian families still don't sit at the same table. Is hatred passed down like inheritance? Or is it a choice we keep making? We'll explore the deeper psychology behind generational feuds and how cycles of violence feed themselves in the next chapter. But first, if you're captivated by the dark legacies that shape American history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because in the next part, we dig into the mindset that made the feud last more than a century. What happens to a child born in the middle of a war they didn't start? Imagine growing up where your last name is enough to earn you a bullet, where stories around the dinner table aren't fairy tales, but revenge tales, where your family tree is pruned by gunfire. For the children of the Hatfields and McCoys, war wasn't a memory, it was a birthright, and hatred was a language spoken before they could read. Can hatred be inherited like land, or is it taught? One story at a time. By the time the feud reached its peak, dozens of Hatfield and McCoy children had been raised in its shadow. Some watched their fathers go to war and never return. Others were handed rifles before they could write their own names. They weren't soldiers, they were legacies, born to defend a history soaked in blood. One of the most heartbreaking realities of the feud was the way it trained a generation to see the world through a lens of vengeance. To be a Hatfield meant distrusting McCoys. To be a McCoy meant preparing for the next ambush. Innocence didn't survive long in the Appalachian hollers. Take the story of Cap Hatfield, Devil Anse's son. Raised in the rugged mountains, Cap was known for his short temper and fierce loyalty. He was deeply involved in the most violent chapters of the feud, believed to be one of the leaders of the New Year's Day raid that killed McCoy children. He didn't flinch at the idea of killing Tam, it was duty. But what kind of future could men like Cap inherit? Could they ever leave that legacy behind? On the other side, the McCoy children were shaped by grief and displacement. Many fled the region, fearing retaliation. Some changed their names. Others spent years in silence, never speaking of what they'd seen. For them, Appalachia wasn't home, it was a battlefield they had barely escaped. The scars ran deep, and they weren't just emotional. The feud created an atmosphere of constant hypervigilance. People didn't walk outside unarmed. Weddings required armed guards. Neighbors spied on each other, and children learned early that any wrong move could reignite the powder keg. Yet amid the darkness, there were flickers of resistance, not from outsiders, but from the youth themselves. A few brave young men and women dared to imagine something else. They looked at the feud not as tradition, but as a curse. Some fell in love across bloodlines, hoping to rewrite their family's stories. Others left the region entirely, trying to build new lives, far from the mountains that remembered too much. One story tells of a McCoy boy who left for Ohio, changed his last name, and never returned. Another tells of a Hatfield girl who married a preacher's son and begged him never to ask about her past. These were acts of rebellion in a culture where loyalty was supposed to be absolute. Their silence spoke volumes. But leaving wasn't always easy, even decades after the last bullet was fired. The Hatfield-McCoy feud remained a stigma. Job applications were denied. Marriages were questioned. Some people introduced themselves by first name only, hiding their lineage like a secret sin. It was as if the feud had become a stain that time couldn't wash away. Psychologists today call this generational trauma, the passing down of fear, anger, and pain from one generation to the next. It's not just a theory. It's written into family traditions, repeated in whispered warnings, carved into expectations. And in the Appalachian Mountains, where oral history carried more weight than books, these traumas became gospel. Trauma doesn't just shape families, it reshapes entire communities. For years, the towns near the Hatfield and McCoy homesteads suffered from a kind of collective PTSD. Law enforcement was seen as unreliable. Schools avoided teaching the full truth. Local politics were divided along bloodlines, and tourists who came for the legend rarely understood the real pain behind it. Worse still, the story of the feud became entertainment. Hollywood took notice. In the 20th century, countless movies, TV shows, and cartoons portrayed the feud as a hillbilly joke. Characters with floppy hats and shotguns chased each other through exaggerated Appalachian forests. The nuance was erased. The pain was replaced with punchlines. Even shows like Looney Tunes and the Beverly Hillbillies drew on the image of feuding hillbillies, making the Hatfield-McCoy conflict seem like harmless folklore. But the real families watched from their porches horrified. They saw their tragedy turned into comedy. They saw graves turned into props. Can a culture heal when its wounds are mocked? Some tried to take back the narrative. Descendants of both families began telling their own stories, writing books, speaking at schools, organizing reunions. They wanted the world to understand that the feud wasn't just about two angry men. It was about poverty, isolation, honor, trauma, and human weakness. One such descendant was Rio Hatfield, a businessman who spearheaded the 2003 Truce recognition ceremony that earned the families a spot in the Guinness World Records. To Rio and others, it wasn't about denying the past, it was about reclaiming it with dignity. Still, the damage was done. Even today, in towns like Mattuan and Pikeville, you'll find people who don't speak the other family's name. Some roads are still unofficially divided. Generational wounds don't vanish just because the guns do. But surprisingly, others have turned the feud into a force for unity. One such example is the annual Hatfield and McCoy Reunion Festival. Every year, both families come together in Pike County to honor their shared history, not through anger, but through food, music, storytelling, and remembrance. They walk the same paths their ancestors once stained with blood. They visit graves, they talk, they laugh. At the festival, you'll see something remarkable: descendants of Devil Anse and Randolph McCoy, dressed in t-shirts bearing their family names, playing music together, sharing barbecue, dancing under the stars. It's not perfect, and the healing isn't complete, but it's a start. Because here's the truth. No one is born a Hatfield or a McCoy in their heart. Those are names, not destinies. The feud didn't have to last for generations, but it did because no one stopped to ask why. Why are we still fighting? Why do we still hate? What will it cost if we continue? These are questions every family, every society, must ask when conflict becomes routine, when war becomes inheritance. Because if we don't question the stories we're told, we become trapped in them. We live out scripts written by people long dead, chasing ghosts with real weapons. The Appalachian Mountains are full of echoes of gunshots, screams, grief, but also of hope. A voice is saying, we can end this. And that may be the most powerful lesson of all. The past doesn't have to own the future. So what can we learn from a war that outlived its cause? That's what we'll explore in the next chapter, where we peel back the deeper cultural and psychological forces that allowed the feud to grow unchecked. We'll examine how family identity, honor culture, poverty, and isolation created the perfect storm and weather other regions today are repeating the same cycle. And ask yourself this: are we still fighting feuds in our own families, our politics, our cultures? If you're finding this story powerful, help us keep it going. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've lived through family conflicts or broken generational patterns. We want to hear your voice. A feud doesn't survive for generations by accident. It survives because something feeds it quietly, constantly, like smoke under a locked door. It's not always the gunshots that keep a war alive. Sometimes, it's the stories, the silence, the pride, the fear. These are the elements that turned Hatfields and McCoys from people into symbols. But what made this feud so explosive? And how many of us are unknowingly trapped in feuds of our own? To understand the depth of this conflict, we need to look beyond bullets and blood. We need to look at the cultural architecture of the Appalachian region in the 19th century, a place isolated by geography, hardened by poverty, and shaped by unwritten codes, more powerful than any law. Start with honor culture, a system where your name was your currency, your word, your bond, and your family, your army. In Appalachia, reputation wasn't just important, it was survival. If someone insulted your kin and you didn't respond, you lost standing in your community. And once that happened, your business suffered, your safety vanished, your voice disappeared. This wasn't pride, it was strategy. In that kind of world, a slight wasn't a small thing. It was a declaration of war. So when the McCoys believed Asa Harmon McCoy had been murdered by Hatfield sympathizers in 1865, it wasn't just a loss, it was a humiliation. When the pig was allegedly stolen, it wasn't just property, it was a challenge. And when the McCoy boys were executed by the Hatfields after the death of Ellison Hatfield, The war became something sacred, unforgivable. Layered over this was poverty deep, grinding, generational poverty. These weren't wealthy plantation families with land to fall back on. The Hatfields built a logging business. Yes, but much of the region was defined by scarcity. Livestock meant food. Timber meant survival. And when the outside world finally took notice of Appalachia, it wasn't to help, it was to exploit. Timber companies, coal barons, and politicians began pushing into the mountains, stirring old rivalries and making new ones. When people are desperate, tribalism becomes stronger. You cling tighter to your people. You trust less. You fight harder. The feud thrived in that soil. Then there was the law, or the lack of it. The Tug Fork River that separated Kentucky from West Virginia also separated law enforcement. If you committed a crime in one state and ran across the river, you were often untouchable. This legal vacuum meant that local families often took justice into their own hands. The concept of due process was replaced by he deserved it, and when the law did get involved, it was rarely neutral. Judges were related to families on trial. Sheriffs were afraid to act. Governors issued threats, but rarely followed through. In this vacuum, vigilantism became the norm. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. But perhaps the most powerful force that kept the feud alive was something more invisible, more insidious. Narrative. Each family told its own version of the feud. Each version placed them as the victims, the righteous defenders of honor, and every time a child heard those stories, the lines deepened. They killed your uncle. They betrayed us. They're animals. The story wasn't just history, it was identity. And when identity is built on pain, peace feels like surrender. This dynamic isn't unique to the Hatfields and McCoys around the world. We've seen similar cycles, from the Balkans to Belfast, Rwanda to the Middle East. Long-standing ethnic, religious, and political feuds often follow the same formula: injury, retaliation, silence, and myth. The enemy becomes more than a person, they become an idea, an evil, a threat to be neutralized. It's easy to judge from the outside. Why didn't they just stop? But that question misses the point. Feuds don't continue because people enjoy them. They continue because people believe they have no choice. When your father was killed, your house burned, your name slandered, what else is left but vengeance? This emotional logic is dangerous because it feels righteous. It's rooted in real pain, and yet it leads nowhere but more pain. This is the paradox of generational conflict. The very thing that feels like justice is the thing that prevents healing. Even Devil Anse Hatfield, the larger-than-life patriarch who once rode with Confederate raiders, eventually recognized this. In his later years, he withdrew from violence. He was baptized in the cold waters of Island Creek. He built a small church. And in 1921, when he died, the community mourned not just a man, but a symbol of a war that never found peace. But his conversion didn't undo the past. Children had still died. Families had still been broken. Generations had grown up in fear. The damage was permanent even if the fighting stopped. And yet, in that truth, there's something powerful, something sobering, because it forces us to ask a deeper question. What stories are we still living that were written by someone else's trauma? How many of us define ourselves by old pain? How many of our family rules, our prejudices, our political stances are inherited, not chosen? How many of us are just continuing a script, never stopping to ask why? The Hatfield-McCoy feud is a cautionary tale, yes, but it's also a mirror. Think about modern political polarization. Online mobs, family members who don't speak over elections. We may not be firing rifles from behind trees, but the hostility, the tribalism, the refusal to forgive, that spirit lives on. So how do we break the cycle? It starts with telling new stories. The descendants who came together for truce ceremonies weren't denying the past, they were reframing it. They were saying, we come from pain, but we don't have to continue it. They turned graves into lessons, names into symbols of resilience. And maybe that's the final irony of the feud. The very names that once brought death are now used to teach peace. In schools across Appalachia, children now learn the story of the Hatfields and McCoys not as a joke, but as history. Teachers use it to spark discussions about anger, identity, and forgiveness. Museums have been built, historical sites preserved, even reality shows have emerged not to mock, but to explore the lasting complexity of these two intertwined families. There's a message in all of this. Pain, when left alone, festers. But pain, when shared and understood, can be transformed. The Hatfield and McCoy story isn't just a feud. It's a map of how trauma travels, how conflict escalates, and how peace is always possible but never easy. In the final chapter, we'll revisit the graves, the descendants, and the legacy left behind. We'll walk the mountain paths where gunfire once echoed and ask the most important question of all. What does it take to forgive the unforgivable? And if you've been following this journey and want to see how it ends, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The conclusion is coming in. Trust me, it's not what you expect. The hills are quiet now. The echo of gunfire is long gone, faded into the wind that rustles through the trees of West Virginia and Kentucky. The blood has dried. The bodies are buried, but the land remembers. And sometimes, if you listen closely, it feels like the feud never really ended, it just changed shape. What does it mean to truly forgive something that defined generations? This is the question that haunts the descendants of the Hatfields and McCoys. For many of them, the feud isn't just a chapter in a history book, it's a ghost at the dinner table, a shadow in the family photo album. It's the reason a grandfather never spoke of his childhood, the reason some family members never crossed a certain bridge or stepped foot on the other side of the river. But time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest blades. In 2000, a Hatfield and a McCoy stood together, not with rifles in their hands, but with microphones. They were on stage at a reconciliation event, speaking not just to the crowd, but to their ancestors. One of them said, "We've carried this burden long enough. It's time to let it down." There was silence, then applause. That moment didn't erase the past, but it did something powerful. It honored the pain without being owned by it. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's not pretending the wounds weren't deep or real. It's choosing to stop passing them on. And that's what the modern Hatfield and McCoys are trying to do: break the chain. But how do you break a chain forged in blood? It starts with remembering everything, not just the parts that justify our side. It means telling the stories of loss and cruelty, not to rekindle anger, but to illuminate its cost. It means admitting that both families committed atrocities, that neither side was innocent, that both were, in the end, victims of something larger than themselves. And it means acknowledging the real cost of generational hatred, not just in lives, but in possibilities. How many marriages never happened because of fear? How many friendships were avoided? How many ideas were never shared? How many children were taught to hate before they learned to read? These are the invisible casualties of a war that lasted far too long. Today, the legacy of the feud is being transformed in schools. Children role-play the trials of the Hatfields and McCoys to learn about justice. They study how bias, fear, and isolation can corrupt a community. In some towns, members of both families now serve side by side in government, law enforcement, education. There are even Hatfield and McCoy family reunions, not separate, but joint. And in 2012, the History Channel aired a critically acclaimed miniseries starring Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton, which portrayed the feud not as a joke, but as a tragedy. It didn't shy away from the violence, but it humanized the people. It showed Devil, ants praying over his lost sons. It showed Randolph McCoy haunted by grief. It showed that behind every act of vengeance was a man, a woman, a child, afraid. And isn't that always the truth behind violence? Fear? Fear of losing control? Fear of dishonor? Fear of being vulnerable. The Hatfields and McCoys fought for decades over pride, land, and memory, but beneath it all was fear. Fear passed down, inherited like a rifle or a name. And the only thing more contagious than fear is story. Because stories decide who we become. The Hatfield-McCoy feud became a story so powerful that it outlived its origin. It became myth. It was bigger than any one person until someone had the courage to rewrite it. That rewriting didn't start with lawyers or politicians. It started with ordinary people, descendants who decided to sit down at the same table, to talk, to listen, to cry, to forgive. They did what their great-grandfathers could not. They chose peace. And in doing so, they showed us something profound. No matter how deep the hatred, no matter how long the fight, it is always possible to choose another ending, but it takes work. It takes unlearning old habits, questioning inherited beliefs, stepping into discomfort. It means looking at the past without letting it write your future. It means seeing the humanity in those you've been taught to despise. The Hatfields and McCoys taught us how easy it is to start a war and how hard it is to end one. But they also taught us that healing is possible, that names don't have to be prisons, that history, while painful, can be a teacher, not a warden. So what about you? Are there feuds in your life that you didn't start but are still part of? Are there stories you were raised with that keep you from seeing someone clearly? Are there old wounds you keep picking at, not because they hurt, but because they define you? Maybe it's time to ask the same question those families finally did. What will it cost to keep fighting? And what might be possible if we stop? In the hills of Appalachia, the graves of the Hatfields and McCoys rest beneath wildflowers and pine. The wind that once carried screams now carries birdsong. The old trails are still there, but today, they lead to museums, not ambushes. Two truce signs, not tombstones. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy they could leave behind. Not the feud, but the end of it. But the story doesn't just end with reconciliation. It continues in the way the communities have evolved through education, through shared culture, and through the powerful choice to remember and learn. The feud has become a tool for teaching empathy and understanding, showing how cycles of violence can be broken. Local historians work tirelessly to preserve artifacts and stories from both sides, creating spaces where descendants and visitors can confront the past with honesty and respect. These efforts aren't about reopening wounds, they're about healing them. And there is hope. Hope that other long-standing conflicts, rooted in fear and misunderstanding, can find their own peace. Hope that we can all learn to listen, even when the stories we hear are painful, because peace doesn't erase history, it transforms it. If you've walked with us through this story, If you've felt the weight of its tragedy in the light of its redemption, we invite you now to carry something forward. Let this be more than history. Let it be a mirror for your family, your country, your beliefs, your wounds. What feud are you still fighting? And are you brave enough to end it? Thank you for being part of this journey. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is listen to the past on, finally choose peace.